This is a screencast on Jack London's To Build a Fire. We're continuing our discussion on realism. All the text in our first unit here, all about realism, the characteristics of realism that we discussed in our initial screencast on the unit. And really, To Build a Fire kind of falls into the realism period, the realism genre. 1865 to 1900 was that time period. But To Build a Fire also kind of falls within a subgenre, subcategory of realism called naturalism. It was about scientific discovery and the power of nature. And so this story really kind of fits characteristics from both of those particular periods of literature. So right from the beginning here, we have a lot of detail, which is one of those characteristics of realism that we talked about, that excessive amount of detail that really feels like we are in the story. It's very believable because we receive so much detail from the author. But right from the beginning, the setting of this story is established, and it's very important from the beginning that you understand the setting of this story in order for everything to kind of fall into place and make sense. And so here we have a young guy, or actually I'm not really sure if he's young. He might be middle-aged, but he's traveling alone, and he's very alone. He's accompanied only by a dog, a wolf dog, a large wolf dog that is native to the area. But there are no other humans anywhere about. And then the setting, the big the antagonist of this entire story is not a person or a human at all. It's nature. We're talking about extreme cold, several degrees below zero. He thinks it's 50 degrees below zero. It's actually much colder than that. It's stark. It's cold, and an extreme in a lot of ways. And so here we have a guy that is attempting to make his way to a camp in Henderson Creek, across this landscape. He's walking off the Yukon Trail there in Alaska. And London is really quick to point out that this guy is a newcomer. He'd never been here before, and so this was his first winter in this area. So he's very quick to point that out because it's important for us to understand that he doesn't really understand just how cold the weather is. As a matter of fact, all of the things that are going to happen are going to be his fatal flaw, that he has no idea how powerful and how deadly nature really can be. And we get that really right from the start of the story. Nature is awe-inspiring, and it is also completely indifferent to human life. It doesn't care whether we live or die. It's going to continue on. There are going to be storms. There's going to be natural disasters that happen that have no bearing. There's no one that can control it. It's uncontrollable. And so he's kind of quick to point that out. Now, this guy had been in places before. He was used to the lack of the sun. He had some idea of the terrain and whatnot, but it was the extreme cold and the extreme isolation that he wasn't used to here. So, looking at this, it says it was not at the top of page 1114. It was not because he was long used to it. He was a newcomer in this land, a Chicago, and this was his first winter. The trouble with him was that he was without imagination. He was quick and alert in the things of life, but only in the things and not in the significances. 50 degrees below zero meant 80 odd degrees of frost. Such fact impressed him as being cold and uncomfortable and that was all. It did not lead him to meditate upon his frailty as a creature of temperature and upon man's frailty in general, able only to live within certain narrow limits of heat and cold. And from there on, it did not lead him to the conjectural field of immortality and man's place in the universe. 50 degrees below zero stood for a bite of frost that hurt and that must be guarded against by the use of mittens, ear flaps, warm moccasins, and thick socks. 50 degrees below zero was to him just precisely 50 degrees below zero. That there should be anything more to it than that was a thought that never entered his head. So London says the trouble with him was that he was without imagination. It causes him to underestimate just how alone he is and just how cold it is and just how cold he could be. He's confident in his survival skills, but his survival skills rely on man-made resources, matches to build a fire, and the materials that he needs to build a fire, and mittens and a jacket and those kinds of things. Natural ability is what he is lacking. He is lacking an understanding of the fact that he probably shouldn't be outside right now in this weather attempting to go anywhere. But he's lacking that imagination. He has a schedule. He has a plan. He has the means to make a fire, and he has his winter gear, and he's confident that he's going to reach his destination before any real danger can befall him. So he sets out on this journey, walking towards Henderson Camp, or Henderson Creek Camp, the place where he's going to meet the boys is what he calls them, his traveling companions. He's meeting up with them, and he plans to meet at 6 o'clock, where supper's going to be waiting for him, where a fire's going to be waiting for him. And so he's walking along, and he spits out of his mouth. And it says, there was a sharp explosive crackle that startled him. He spat again and again in the air. Before it could fall to the snow, the spittle cracked. So his spit is literally freezing as he's spitting it out of his mouth before it can hit the ground. And the thought comes to him that, hey, it might be a little colder than 50 below zero if I can spit and it freeze like an icicle in the air before it hits the ground. But here he goes again. The temperature did not matter because he's got a plan. He's on the path. He thinks that he is confident enough to make it to the camp so that he can warm up then. Now, as a reader, we're already kind of seeing that this guy is not very bright in the ways of this nature. He has no idea what is actually happening. He doesn't even really know what temperature it really is. And for us, especially here in the South, the thought that we could spit out of our mouth and it freeze before it hits the ground, we've never experienced such extreme temperatures unless you've traveled to a place where they have extreme temperatures before. So that is, as a reader, we're already kind of seeing that, yeah, he might be in a little bit of trouble, but we want to read on. It's kind of like a train wreck. We want to stay with it because we want to know what is going to happen. And so he's thinking about is his plan and when he's going to stop and eat lunch. And he's carrying his lunch inside his jacket to keep it from freezing. He wants to keep his biscuits from freezing, it says. And he's thinking about that, and he's thinking about when he stops to eat lunch, and he's going to cut open those biscuits and sop them in bacon grease and all this good stuff. And so that's what he's thinking about instead of paying attention really to what's going on around him. Moving into that next paragraph, we see that the trail that he is walking on is not very well marked. It's been snowing really heavily. It's kind of covering up the well-tread areas where people have already passed through. It says he was glad he was without a sled, traveling light. In fact, he carried nothing but the lunch wrapped in the handkerchief. He was surprised, however, at the cold. It certainly was cold, he concluded, as he rubbed his numb nose and cheekbones with his mittened hand. He was a warm-whiskered man, but the hair on his face did not protect the high cheekbones and the eager nose that thrust itself aggressively into the frosty air. So he's protected his body. He has his warm weather gear on. He has his mittens on and his boots. But again, his lack of knowledge, his naivete, like his beard is not even protecting his face fully from the temperature elements that he is going through. And so he's thinking about, scientifically, he's thinking about the cold. He's thinking about the dog here in that next paragraph that's traveling with him. And the dog itself is native to this land. So he knows cold. He knows it instinctively. It's not something, obviously, if he's an intelligent creature or whatever, it's not like he can articulate that. But he's been in this weather before. He knows. And he knows that it's dangerous. And he knows that it is too cold for them to be out walking around. And we see here that it was not merely colder than 50 below zero. It was colder than 60 below, then 70 below. It was 75 below zero. Since the freezing point is 32 above zero, it meant that 107 degrees of frost obtained. The dog didn't know anything about thermometers, obviously, but he had learned that man means food, means shelter, and specifically means fire. The dog had learned fire, and it wanted fire, or else to burrow under the snow and cuddle its warmth away from the air. Sled dogs would often dig themselves big kind of tunnels underneath the snow, or they could burrow down and be protected from the cold, the wind, and the frost. Okay, so the dog is not a stranger. He understands, and he's waiting for the man to stop, to make shelter, and to build a fire. But the man has a plan. Like, he has a plan. He's on his he's got to stay on his path. Okay, so we're seeing here that the dog understands. The dog, who is not a human, understands that his instincts are telling him that something is wrong, that he needs a fire. Whereas our man here is still, he's confident that he can do this, but he doesn't have any of those instinctualizations that tell him that this is not really a good idea. Okay, so they're walking. The man's beard, every time he exhales, is freezing with the moisture that's coming out of his mouth. And he's actually starting to grow a tobacco spit icicle because he's unable to spit clear from his face. So here he is. His beard is frosting over. He's got a tobacco spit icicle hanging off of his face. But, it's just cold. He's got his plan, and he's going with it. Okay, so as they're walking along this frozen creek, the man is only thinking about his schedule. He's only thinking about stopping to eat his lunch. He's not fully aware of his surroundings, and occasionally popping back into his head that it's very cold. Here we go in this paragraph here at the bottom of that page. He says that it was very cold and that he had never experienced such cold. And he's, doing all the things that you do when you're cold. You're rubbing your hands together. You're rubbing your hands over your face with your mittens, trying to kind of keep yourself warm. But he's noticing that his skin immediately starts going numb as soon as he stops rubbing it. And so he's like, it's cold. It sure is cold outside. Which we're seeing as a reader, this guy is overlooking danger warning signs, warning, like left and right. Okay. So he's going along about 2 hours before lunch. The man happens upon like these several dangerous places in the ice. So he's walking and fresh snow is kind of falling on this frozen lake that he's trying to cross, and what he's walking across, and he sees that he knows in his mind that people have fallen into the ice before, and so he's trying to be careful. At one place he sends the dog across first in front of him to test the ice, and the dog breaks through the ice. The dog, who's aware of this, and he's aware of this cold, he immediately jumps out of the water and starts trying to pick the ice sickles that have formed on his legs and his underbelly off, because he knows that if it freezes, it'll harden his coat. And so again, we see how instinctual the dog is But the man is still kind of oblivious. It's like warning sign number 2000 that at this point that he's ignoring. He takes his gloves off to try to help the dog pick the ice out, but they become numb almost immediately. And again, dude is like, man, it sure is cold outside. I'm going to stop this screencast and I'll pick up with the second half in the second video.